In this video, we'll be implementing the route that will allow us to create a task using the data that we pass in via JSON request body. So let's open up Atom. And you can see here that this is the route that we implemented on the previous video to get results on a per page basis. We're just going to close that up for the moment because we're not going to use that one. And we're going to go to the one that handles where we don't pass in anything, so it's just /tasks. So if we expand that, and you can see this was the route here to get all tasks. Now, if you remember, if I just minimize that, we created a placeholder for the post, which is used to do a create. So this is where we're going to be spending our time in this lesson. So the first thing I'm going to do is create some space, just so we can see where we are. And we will be creating obviously a task using the passed in data, but also we'll be querying and inserting into the database. So the first thing we need to do is to set up our try and catch, just like in previous lessons. So try and catch, and the same that we did in the previous lessons, task exception EX and PDO exception EX. So we'll just fill these in, and these obviously need to handle a standard error response. So we'll just code these in here now. We'll just set up our standard error response here. So we need to set the HTTP status code. It'll be a 400 because the task has some incorrect data in or can't create the task correctly. Set success false. And then we'll add a message. And we'll pass in the exception message. And then we will send and exit. So that's the first one. And we'll just copy this for the PDO exception. That one is a 500 error though. And we'll pass in an actual error message. Get rid of that. And this will be catching the insertion of a task into the database. Obviously we're using post, which is used to create. So we'll just add in an error message here. Fail to insert task into database. Check submitted data for errors. There we go. And then obviously because it's a database error, we want to log that for our system administrators. So we use the error log, and we'll pass in database query error, append the exception, and then 0 for our PHP error log. Okay, that looks fine, so we'll just save that, and then we'll go back up to the try statement because this is where we're going to be implementing a lot of the code here. Now this request's a little bit different to the ones that we've been handling previously. This will have a request body, which is some data that we need to handle. Now this data is in JSON format, so it'll look something like, just bear with us and I'll just draft it out here. I don't know, maybe something like title and then my title here, and then it'll be something like description with my desk here. So you can see there, this bit here, this is JSON, and this is the format that we'll be using to pass in our details. So when we want to create a task, the title is this value here that we insert, and the description is this value here that we insert. Now obviously there's other fields that belong to a task, but just for demonstration purposes, you can see here that this is the format that we'll be reading from. So this is valid JSON, so we need to check that the passed in data is of type JSON. So the way you do that, you send a request header, an HTTP request header for content type that is of type application/JSON. So we need to make sure that it is that type that we've passed in. Now, I'm just going to get rid of that because that's not valid code for PHP, that's JSON code. So that was just a demo, what I'm going to be doing here. So we need to do a check to make sure that the content type request header is set to application JSON. And if it isn't, we need to send a standard error response back to the client and exit. So we'll just do that here now. So if, and then we use the server global array, and then it's for content underscore type. And then what we need to do is say if it's not equal to application/JSON, then send in error response. So we'll just create our response now. New response. So response set HTTP status code. And this is a 400 error, which means a bad request, because obviously we haven't submitted the right type of content from the client point of view. And then response set success. And then we'll say false. Response, we'll add a message. And we'll just say that content type header is not set to JSON. And then we'll response, we'll send that and then exit. So that's our first check we've done there, is to make sure the content type which is sent in the request header is application JSON. And I'll show you where we do that in Postman when we test this out later. So now we need to get this data that's passed in the request body. And the way you do that is to use PHP input. Now I'll just quickly show you this here. So if I just call this raw post data, and we will be file, I'll explain this in a second, file get contents, and then it's PHP input. So what we're doing here is, ignore this variable at the moment, we're using the file get contents, which should read, so say we're dealing with a file, reads the contents of the file and stores it in a variable. But what we're doing here, instead of passing in a file path, we pass in this sort of input from PHP. Now what this does is allows you to have a look or inspect the body of the request that's sent. So we're going to be putting JSON code in the body. Now what we want to do is just pull in that in its rawest form, hence the name of the variable that we've created. And then we're going to try and decode that as JSON using a PHP function. So this PHP input will pull in the request body, so the request data that you've sent, not the headers, just the body of it. And then we'll store it in that. And then what we're going to do is just to make sure that it is valid JSON. Now the way that you do that is an if statement, and we use the JSON decode. Decode. If you remember, we used the JSON encode when we took an array, converted to JSON. Now this does something very similar, but does it the opposite way. So it takes JSON and converts it into an object that we can use the details from. So JSON decode, and we'll pass in this variable here because that's what we're trying to decode. Raw post data. But this function here, if it isn't valid JSON that you've passed in, will return false. So we need to check to make sure that it's not false. And if it's not, we need to store that in a variable so we can use the JSON data in the JSON format. So we'll create a variable here called JSON data, and we'll assign that. But we need to make sure that it's not false. So we'll just put the exclamation mark there to do our check, because if it is false, we need to send back an error response. If it's not false, which means that it is valid JSON and has decoded it successfully, we'll then move on to the rest of the code that we're going to implement. So I'm just going to copy this up here as a basis and then paste it in there. It just saves us a little bit of time. So what we're going to do here is just change, it's still a 400 error because it is a client error. You haven't sent the right type of data to the server. And we're just going to change the message here to request body is not valid JSON. So we'll send that and exit. Okay, now that we've got our data in the JSON variable, we can use that to check the data, to use the data. And the first check we're going to do is to make sure that the client has provided the mandatory fields. Now remember, for a task to be created, the two mandatory fields are a title and the completed status. It's not too bothered about a description or a deadline, but it must have a title and a completed status. So I'll just scroll down a bit, make some space here, and we need to do an if statement. So if, and we're checking to make sure that these are provided, but if they're not, we're going to send a standard error response back here. So we'll do if, and the way that we do it is use the object, the JSON data object, and we can access them by using this. Now, you're probably thinking, how does this work? So this here, title, is what you call the element in the JSON data that you pass in. So if I just quickly explain, I'll just write that JSON out again. So title, and then my title here. Oops. So that there, title, maps to this here. So this is the element name or the key. And then we can use that just by calling JSON data object and the title. It's a bit like a PHP object, and you're just calling the instance variable. So we can use this to check whether it exists or not. So I'm just going to get rid of this again, just to clear it up, because that's not valid PHP code. So what we want to do is check to see if this exists. And the way that you do that is use the isSet function. So isSet, whoops. And then I'll just wrap the end bracket around there. So isSet JSON data title. So if it exists in the passed in JSON, then obviously we can carry on with that. But just like the way that we've coded everything else, but if it doesn't exist, so then if we put an exclamation mark, if it doesn't exist, then we will put our error response here. But we also need to double check to make sure that the completed status is in there. So it's very similar to this. So we'll do an OR, because these have to exist. And then we'll do the same. So it is set, and then it's JSON data and completed. So now that we've got that, that's the two checks that we need to do with mandatory data. We need to handle the error response now, so we'll just quickly create it. Response, new response, and we're going to do something slightly different with this one, and I'll explain when we get there. And we'll just set the HTTP status code. Oops. It's 400 error because it's client. And we'll set success as false. And then we're going to add some messages. Now, on the response, obviously we can add multiple messages, and that's what we're going to do here. We're going to add a message to say the title's missing, if it is, only if it is missing, and if the completed status, completed, is also missing. So that's two separate messages we're going to add, only if one or the other is missing. So the way we'll do that is to use the ternary operator again, as you've seen in a previous lesson. So it's like a one-liner if statement. So we'll just quickly set up the message. So response, add message, and we'll do this one for the title. So title field is mandatory, and must be provided. Okay, so that's the message there. Now what we want to do is use this check here to see if it is there. If it is, then we don't send this. But if it isn't, then we do. So we need to do the check at the beginning. So is set, and then it was JSON data title. Now remember the ternary operator is question mark, which means then. So we're saying if it doesn't exist, remember the exclamation mark, if it doesn't exist, then add this message. Otherwise, just return false. Now that won't do anything. It just means that it won't run this function here. So we're just returning false. So if we wrap that in brackets and put a semicolon at the end, so we're basically saying if title doesn't exist, then add this message to the response, otherwise false. Now if we copy that, to save us typing it out again, and we do the same for completed, and change the message, and we'll say completed field is mandatory and must be provided. So if the title's missing, then it'll add this message. If the completed is missing, then it adds this message. Now, if they're both missing, it will add both of the messages, which is good because we want to see what's missing. It allows the client to see that. So then, after we've added the messages, we need to send the response. Send, and then exit. Okay, so now that we've handled the mandatory fields, make sure that they exist. The next thing we need to do is to try and create a task from all of the other passed in data. So hopefully that we should be able to, we've done the basic checks here, so we should be able to create a task. Obviously we are within the try, so if it does fail to create a task for any reason, our error response here for the task, it'll be able to handle that. So if we create a new task, we'll call this new task, and then we'll just try and create a new task and pass in the data. So what we need to do here is, remember the first parameter for task is the task ID. That is provided by the system, so we need to provide null here because we're not deciding that. So null, and then the next one is the title. Now go back up slightly. You see here how we get the title is to use this format here. So that's all we'll be doing here. So JSON data and then title. Now we're not doing any validation on the title apart from making sure that it's there before we try and create it because it's mandatory. But remember the task does its own validation on the format, the criteria, you know, that sort of thing. Make sure it's not more than 255 characters, that sort of thing. Now, if part of this validation was to fail, this task exception here would catch that. The next bit was the description. Now, because the description is optional, we need to provide obviously some data here, and that data would just be null, which is a bit like what we did for the task ID. Now, if it exists, we need to put the data in, but if it doesn't exist, we need to put null. So this sounds like a good scenario to use this ternary operator again. So that's what we'll be doing. So if it's set JSON data, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to make some space here just so I can see what I'm doing. So if it's set JSON data, what was it? It was description, wasn't it? So description, then we'll add in JSON data description because we want to use it. Otherwise, null. If description is set, like I say, we're not doing any validation here. We're not saying, well, you know, it must contain 12 characters, you know, nothing like that, because the task exception will handle all of that. So if description is set, then pass in the description, the passed in description here as a third parameter for the new task. otherwise it's null. So that should be that one. The next one we need to do was title, description. It was deadline. So we're going to do very similar here again. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it here and just show you this. So the next bit of data was deadline, and we're going to say if deadline exists, then change this, then use the data that's passed in for deadline, otherwise null. Scroll right slightly, there you go. And the last thing, we know this is provided because it is a mandatory field here that we checked. So a bit like what we did with title, we can just type this in here. So JSON data completed. So we're not doing any checks on that because we've already done them just above it. So this should create the new task from the passed in data. So now what we need to do, we need to get these values back out and store them in variables ready to insert in our database. Now the reason that we do, that we do this and don't use the variables or the data directly from the JSON data is because our task performs the validation. So we try and create a task, and then if it succeeds, then great. Then all we do is use this new task and pull the data back out. So we'll just quickly create some variables, title, and we'll just say, oops, new task, get title. And the next one was description. New task, get description. Just make sure I spelled them right. Description, yeah. Next one was deadline. And that was new task. Yeah, get deadline. And the last one was completed. Oops. And it was new task, get completed. So now that we've got the data in the variables, we now need to create our query to insert this data into the tasks table. Now, a bit like what we've done before, we'll create the query. This one's obviously going to be against the right database because we're putting data in, so it needs to go against the master DB. You don't have to obviously design it this way, but I think it's a good sort of architectural way of designing your application so it can scale in the future if need be. So right DB, need to prepare, and then we will write our insert statement into here. So insert into TBL tasks, and the columns, which is title, description, description, deadline, completed. And then the values, and that is title, because obviously we're putting placeholders in here, description, it's deadline next, but we need to format that, so str to date. So obviously we're passing in a string in a format that we decide, which is day/month/month/YYYY, and then space our :minute. So obviously we need to tell the database what sort of format to expect. So that's all we're doing here. So we're using string to date, and then we're doing deadline, and then we're using the format mask. Now obviously we're using single quotes within this string, so we need to escape them here. So the way that you escape them is by backslash and then a single quote. So I'll just put another one for the end, and then we'll put them here. So it was %d /%m %y space %h : %i. So that is the format, day, month, year, hour, minute. So now that we've got this function here, we'll we'll just, what was the next one? Completed. So completed was the next bit of data we're putting in. Yep, that looks fine. So that's our SQL query there for the insert statement. So we're trying to put obviously the data that we've passed in into TBL tasks, title, description, deadline, and completed. Title, description, obviously we'll format the deadline into a proper date. We'll escape obviously the mask here and here at the end, and then we pass in the completed. So now what we'll do is to bind these parameters. So remember query bind param, and the first one was obviously title, and then that was the title up here. Remember, because we're getting the title, description, deadline from the task object that we've created with the data that we've passed in. And this is of type PDO param str because it's a string. Now I'm just going to copy and paste these. So we've got title, description, deadline, and completed. So we'll just make the changes here. So title, description, description here, deadline, and that's here, and then completed. Completed. Okay, now that we've bound the parameters, just create some space, scroll down so we can see where we are. We need to execute the query. So query execute. So that should insert it. Now what we're going to do now is just to make sure that it has inserted it, we're going to get a row count. Now if we call the row count function, that should return how many rows was affected. Now obviously we're only inserting one row, so it should be just one. So obviously then we need to perform a check to make sure that it's not 0, and if it is 0, then throw our standard response for an error out. So we'll get that here, row count equals query row count, and then what we need to do is to do a check on that. So if row count is equal to 0, which means that it has failed, so we need to set our standard error response here. So response, new response, oops, response, and then we'll set the HTTP status code, and what we'll do here to 500 error, because it's a server issue if it hasn't been able to insert the row into the database for some reason. And then we'll set the success to false, and then we'll add a message of fail to create task. We'll send and exit. Okay, so that's handled the error. So if I just scroll down, create some more space and scroll down again. Now we're past the error. We now want to, if it has created the row or the task in an API, what you should do is when you create something, you should create it, and if it's successful, then what you should do is also return that same data back. It allows clients to use the data that you've submitted in a format that that's consistent with every other sort of get task call. So what we need to do is to do a fetch now from the database of the inserted row and return that in a response. So the way that we do that, we need to know what the last task ID was, because we don't want to bring back all obviously tasks. We just want to bring back the one that we've just created. Now there is a function, it's part of the PDO functions in PHP called last insert ID. Now you're probably thinking, well, there's going to be multiple people using this. Why doesn't it return, if two rows get inserted at roughly the same time? It might corrupt, as in we might get someone else's task ID back. But it's only for this session. So it's guaranteed that we will only get the ID that we've inserted and not someone else's task ID. So we'll store that. So we'll call this last task ID, and we will get this from, it's not the query this time, it is actually the database connection. So it was the write DB, and it was last insert ID. So that gets that ID back. Now what we want to do is another database query to select that task where the task ID is this ID. Now obviously we've done that when we got the single task, earlier on in the videos using task ID here. So it's just going to be very similar to that. But the one big difference here is that we'll be calling the retrieval on the write DB. Now the reason why we do this is the slaves or the read databases are asynchronous. So by the time we've created this, we're immediately trying to return this from the database. Now it may not have had time to populate or to push this data to the read slaves. So we must call this on the write DB, even though it is just a read statement. So what we do here is create the another query, and we'll do this on the write DB. Oops, write DB, and it is prepare. And then, oops, I need to put in quotes. So select ID title, description. And then remember, deadline, we need to return in a certain format. So date format, and it was deadline, and then the format was %d/%m, %m/%y, capital Y, because we want to return the 4 digits, not just the 2. And then hour, then minute. And then we want to alias that as deadline, and we also want to return completed from TBL tasks, where ID is equal to task ID. That should be fine. So all we're doing here is returning ID, title, description, deadline, and the completed status from the tasks table, where the ID is that of the last inserted task. For example, the one that we've just created, basically. So if we go back, now obviously we need to bind the parameter. So query, bind param, and it was task ID, and it was the last task ID. And this is PDO param int, because it's an integer. Then we need to execute it. So it's query, execute. And then we obviously need to return the row count. Make sure that is a row there for that task ID. Otherwise, we need to return a standard error response. So it's just handling all the errors. To be honest, that's what majority of this code is. It's handling the errors. So go back here and get the row count, and that is query row count. And then we need to do the check. So if row count is equal to 0, as in it can't find it, then response equals new response. Set HTTP status code to 500 error, because obviously there's something gone wrong on the server side here if it can't get the row. Set success. Response. Set success as false. And then we'll add a message here. Add message, just something basic. Fail to retrieve task after creation. And then send and exit. Okay, so that's handled that error. Create some more space. So if it has been able to get the task back, then we need to get that row and then send it in a success response this time, a bit like what we're doing with the single task. So we'll just quickly do that. So it's the while statement again, and then it was row, and I need to get that row, so query fetch, and then it was associative array, wasn't it? Because that's what we've been using. Fetch assoc, and then we need to store the task. So we need to pass in these details here to all of the row. Yeah. So row ID, row title, oops, row description, deadline, and last one, row completed. Yeah, that's fine. And then we need to actually, we haven't created our task array, have we? So we need to do that to be able to append it to that. So if we create a task array, sorry about that, just getting a bit ahead of myself here. Task array, new, oops, array. So I've created a blank task array here, which is fine. So we've done that bit there. Now we need to append it. So task array, and then append task. Yeah, that looks right. No, it isn't, because we need to return the task as an array. Yeah, return task as array. That's fine. Yeah, that looks right now. So not just return the task, we need to return it as an array, so we can use JSON encode to output it in a nice format. So we need to create the return data now. Return data array, and then we need to create the rows returned, and that is the row count. Yeah. So this is just what we're doing in when we retrieve tasks anyway. So I know you're probably thinking, well, why are you retrieving it again? Because as part of REST APIs, every time you create something, you should also return it back to the client. So that's what we're doing here. So return data, and this is tasks, because we need to add the tasks array, and then we need to create the response to return all of this. So new response, and then response set HTTP status code. Now this one is a 201 because we've created something here. So this is the successful response that we're sending back, which includes the created task as part of the tasks. So because we've created one, we're now at the success point. So it's a 201 to say something has been created. So response set success, and that is true. And then we'll just add a message. And we'll just say task created. And then we need to set the data. Don't forget to do that. That is important. And that's obviously our return data array that we've created. Yeah. And then we need to send and exit. Let's get rid of the white space. Okay, we should be there now. So I'll just save that. Let us quickly go back up the top and just a brief run through. So this first one was the if statement for the get, which handles getting all tasks. We're handling the post here, which is the creation. Now this is in here because the route we'll be using is /tasks, and we'll be posting to that. We don't post to tasks/to, which would be a task ID, because we don't know any ID at this point. So you always post to /tasks. So I'll get rid of that. We'll open our try statement. So within that we have the if statement to make sure the content type is application/JSON, basically JSON data. If not, send a error response back. We'll then get the body from the request using the file get contents PHP input. We'll save that in a variable called raw post data. What we'll then try and do is create or decode the JSON from this raw post data. If it succeeds, then great. However, if it doesn't, it'll return false. So we're checking for false here. If it's false, we send an error response. The next thing we do to make sure that our title, mandatory title, and completed status, these are mandatory, are included in the request. Otherwise, we send a response. We'll then tag some messages on, error messages, I guess. If they're not, if they are provided, we'll then try and create a new task using the data that's been passed in the JSON request body. We'll then get that bit of data out, and then we try and insert it into a database. Once we've inserted it, we then need to retrieve it, because with every post request, if it's successful, it should also return the object that we've created. So then we try and get it back out based on the last task ID, which is this one here, which is the last insert ID. Scroll down, and then what we do is return as normal the standard response for a success, which is the envelope which has the status code, the success flag, and any messages, but also the data, which includes the rows returned and the tasks themselves. So if we can test this now, make sure MAMP's running, and if we open Postman, we will new request here. Don't forget, we're posting now, we are creating something. And if we type in http localhost 8888 and it was /v1/tasks. So if we just try and send that now, we get an error back saying the content type header is not set to JSON. So that's good, that's a valid error, and you can see that it's been a bad request. It's a 400 error. So the way that you set the content type header is by going into the body. We're sending raw data, and the type is application JSON, so it's JSON data. Now I've just clicked on that, and what you've probably seen there is the headers now has 1. So if we click on that, it automatically puts in the content-type and its application JSON. Now that's what we're checking for. So if we send this now, we've got rid of that error, but now it says the request body is not valid JSON. Now that is also correct, because in the body, we don't have any JSON at all. We actually haven't specified any JSON. So what I'll do here is now create our JSON body. So curly brace, and obviously your end curly brace. Now here is where you supply the fields that you're passing in. So title, new title for post test. So if I just send that now, if I scroll up, you can see there we now get a different error message. So the completed field is mandatory and must be provided. Now obviously title and completed are mandatory. We've supplied title. However, if I quickly just change this to completed and send this again, I know that value makes no sense for this variable here, but if I just send that, it now says the title field is mandatory and must be provided. So if I take them out completely and send that, it's still valid JSON because we've got the curly braces, that's the start and end of JSON, but our fields are now missing. Now you can see there we now have an array of messages. So title field is mandatory and must be provided, and the completed field is mandatory and must be provided. So we will do this now. So title, new title from post, and we'll give it a completed status of no. Remember, completed must be Y or an N. So actually, to test it, what I'm going to do is just type some data in here. So we'll send that. So you can see there, the errors are also working because we've got task completed must be Y or N. So this is your client, obviously interacting with the server, and we're getting some helpful error messages back here. So if we say no to that, this should create a new task and return it back because we're provided the title and the completed status. So we'll send that. You can see now we've got a 201, which is a created. So if we go over here, you can see created. Messages task created, but also we've got some data here, which is rows returned 1 and then your task. So you can see there it has a task ID of 39. It's got a title of the passed in title that we've created up here. It didn't have a description because we haven't supplied one. It didn't have a deadline because we didn't supply one. It does have a completed status of N, which is what we supplied up here. So now this task has been added to our task list. So if we create a new request here, and we'll just type in localhost port number v1 tasks, and we're just going to run a get on this, and this should return all tasks in the database. And if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, keep going, there you go, you can see our task is now listed in the get all tasks. So that has successfully created a task for us. If I go back to the post request, and if we just change this again to second test from post, but then we supply a description, and we'll just say description text here, and we'll also supply a deadline because we're just going to make sure that it's all working. Remember, deadline is in a certain format, so it was day, so I'll just say 01/01/2019, and we'll say 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So if we create that now, got back an error message that says the request body is not valid JSON. That is correct because I can see what I've done wrong there. I haven't actually put a comma there, so that's my mistake. All the fields must be separated by a comma. So it just shows that the test is actually validating our error messages. So now that looks correct to me now. So if I send, see that's created a new task again. It has a task ID of 40. So it's now got a title of second test from post. It has my description in there. It has my deadline there. So the 1st of the 1st, 2019. It has the completed status. So now if we go back to the get all tasks, we should have a new one after this 39. So if I send that, scroll down, there you go, you can see our 40. So that's our task there being created. So now that we've proved that that works, just go back to Atom. What we'll do now is move on to updating an existing task. Now, this one has a lot of logic in it, which is why I wanted to leave it till last, because some of the logic we'll be using in there, we have used in here. So we'll be getting the JSON data, we'll be decoding it, and we'll be updating it, and then returning the updated task. Like I say, this was the easier part here to explain. We've been through a lot of the similar functionality that we'll be using in the update request. So now we'll move on to that.